Imagine this candle is your wealth and the flame is your costs, the costs that you have to cover. Now the flame only lasts as long as there is wax, right? Now imagine that you could have a candle where the light never goes out, meaning that you have so much wealth that you never run out of money. Now I spent weeks researching and reading all those research papers to find out how we really never run out of money. And many people, you may have heard of it before, calculate with the 4% rule. But what is the 4% rule? Where did it come from? And is it still up to date? Can we rely on this rule? Let's talk about it. We'll do this in 4 parts, but just real quick to set the tone for this video. The issue in retirement is that our earning capacity basically goes down to 0, meaning that we cannot or don't want to actively earn money anymore. And it doesn't even matter if you're talking about the regular retirement or early retirement here. We're talking about retirement in the sense that you don't actively earn money anymore for whatever reason. And in that time, we never know how long it's going to be, right? And if we are not careful and we take too much out of our portfolio each year, then the worst case is that we end up broke before we die. On the other hand, we do not want to live too frugal so we don't end up the richest person in the graveyard, especially for those people who do not want to leave a bequest. And that is where safe withdrawal rates come in. And safe withdrawal rate means to know how big this percentage is. So a safe withdrawal rate is the maximum percentage that we can take out of our whole portfolio every year without the risk of running out of money. Okay. Now, the 4 parts that we'll talk about are: part number 1 will be about the Trinity Study, where the 4% rule originates from. So if you're not familiar with the 4% rule yet, you'll learn along the way. Then we'll talk about an update of the Trinity Study and also the critique of the Trinity Study. We'll shortly touch on Monte Carlo simulations. And lastly, we're going to talk about a deep analysis for early retirees. So everyone who wants to retire before 65 or before 60. I will timestamp the sections, so if you're already familiar with some parts, then feel free to just skip to the parts that are most important to you. All right, now let's talk about the Trinity Study. Now, the Trinity Study is a peer-reviewed research article. It was published by Cooley, Hubbard and Waltz in 1998. And what they did is they used historical data. That is data from the stock market. So they used the annual returns from 1926 to 1995. And they used those data to calculate ending portfolio values. I know, sounds complicated, but it's kind of like your leftovers from pizza night. So if you eat the whole pizza at once, there's nothing left. If you eat only half the pizza, then the next day you still have 50%. Meaning, if a person started out with a portfolio value of, let's say, $1 million and withdrew X% per year, then how much was left after X years is the ending portfolio value. When we take the picture from before, in fact, let me draw that a little bigger. All right, now if this is our portfolio, so this is your money, right? Not just cash, but all the investments that you have. In this case, particularly stock and bonds investments. And what they did is they calculated with different withdrawal rates. So they tested withdrawal rates from 3%, and then in 1% steps, they took out 4%, 5%, 6%, up to 12%, all right? So 3% up to 12%. Okay, and then they did 2 calculations. One was the portfolio success rate just with the return and the withdrawal. And the second one was adjusted for inflation. With the inflation adjusted, they took the withdrawal rate, like 3% in the first year. And after that, they took the same withdrawal rate, but the inflation rate of that year on top. Today, we are only going to look at the inflation adjusted scenario, because the other thing is like calculating the calories on your pizza, but without counting the cheese. All right, just real quick, to understand all these terms, what is the portfolio success rate? So basically they had to think of what they count as success, right? And theoretically, there are many different ways to do that. For example, you could say, okay, the portfolio success rate is when 50% of the portfolio is left, or when 75% is left, or 25% is left. But they, and this is important for us, they calculated a success when there was more than 0 left. So everything over 0 was counted as success. So after taking all this money out and there's just $1 left, then this would count as a success. In other words, they pretty much calculated with capital depletion, which means in the study it would be okay if almost all the capital was depleted after the end. Okay, and since we're already talking about the end, they calculated with 4 different payout periods, which was 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, and 30 years. Because this is within the range of the life of most retirees. So they took the real returns of the market each year and then simulated with those different retirement years, payout years. For example, they started in the year 1926 plus 15 years, and then plus 20 years, plus 25 years, plus 30 years. You get the picture. So 4 different time horizons, and they tested 5 different portfolios. They looked at 100% stocks, and within the stocks part, they looked at the S&P 500. And then they looked at 75% stocks, 25% bonds, 50% stocks, 50% bonds, 25% stocks and 75% bonds, and 100% bonds. And for the bonds, they use long-term, high-grade corporate bonds. So they used corporate bonds, not government bonds. That's very important for us. Take that into consideration when we get to the results in a minute. We will look at the results and you will see a lot of percentages, and this will show the portfolio success rate. And this will show the percentage of all past payout periods. So example, when you see a success rate of 90%, that means the portfolio was a success in 90 out of 100 cases. Okay, now let's look at the results. So for this video, I only picked, as we discussed, the inflation adjusted one. And I also picked only the one from 1926 to 1995, just because that is a very long time horizon. And we have the Great Depression and World War II included. So that means we have a wide range of possible economic scenarios. So the worst cases, if you want to call it that, are already included in this picture we're just going to take a look at. Okay, just one more note. These numbers are not adjusted for taxes and also not adjusted for transaction costs. All right. So here on the left, you can see the different portfolios, like we talked about, 100% stocks, 75% stocks, and so on. And within each portfolio, also the different time horizons, like or the different payout periods, right? From 15 years to 30 years. And then in the different columns, you see the different withdrawal rates from 3% in 1% steps right up to 12%. So what that very first number here tells us, the 100%, is that a person who had 100% stocks in their portfolio and they took out 3% every year over a time period of 15 years, then 100% of cases, so all the cases, would not have run out of money. But remember, the success rate here was above 0. So it may have been that 100% of those cases ended up at $1 at the end. But I don't actually think that was the case, that, everyone ended up with $1. I think what's important for us to know is that it was enough. All right, now just for you to get the hang of this, when we look at the last number here, the 0, which means that someone who invested 100% of their portfolio into bonds and they had a payout period of 30 years and they took out 12% out of their portfolio every year, then no one of them would have a success, which means none of them would have had anything left, not even $1, after 30 years of taking that much out of the portfolio. Okay, and when we now take a look at this table in general, it doesn't come as a surprise that the more you take out of your portfolio, the less money you're gonna have left, which explains why the success rate, the portfolio success rate, gets less and less with a higher withdrawal rate, right? But not just that, when you look at the numbers in the columns going down, someone who has a shorter payout period, like 15 years, has a better chance of having a success than someone who pays out over 30 years. Okay, what I also found interesting, but for me personally not too surprising, is that the more bonds you have in your portfolio, the more likely you are to run out of money in retirement. And it kind of makes sense because bonds have a fixed income. So there's a fixed interest rate that you get paid out every year, but there is not really an upside potential. So the higher your percentage of bonds in your portfolio, the more likely it is that you run out of money, especially when the payout period is longer than 15 years. And just real quick, let's look at a withdrawal rate of 8% because I remember that Dave Ramsey sometimes talks about withdrawal rates of 8% or sometimes even 12%. Now, even when we assume a 100% stocks portfolio at an 8% withdrawal rate, and let's assume the longest payout period of 30 years, then only 41 people out of 100 will not run out of money. So just for you to have a way to look at this table, right? With 25% bonds, it would only be 34 people. Okay, now let's look at the 3% and the 4% column because the 4% rule became popular with this paper. And you may ask yourself why? I certainly did, because when we look at the 100% stocks portfolio, the 4% withdrawal rate, and the 30 years payout period, only 95 of 100 people, did not run out of money. Now, I believe that this was just considered enough. So this was considered good enough to say that 4% is a safe withdrawal rate that basically prevents you from running out of money in retirement. Funny enough, by the way, when we look at the 75% stocks and the 25% bonds portfolio, then we have 98% success portfolio rate, which means that 98 people out of 100 did not run out of money. So this here was better than the 100% stocks portfolio. So the bonds here seem to have a stabilizing effect. And one more note on that. There was one person, his name is William Bengen, who was working as a practitioner in investment management. And he is a bit considered like the inventor of the 4% rule because he had done calculations for his clients. And he came to similar results like this study. And he also was an advisor for the Trinity Study that we just talked about. And in 1994, he had published an article where he showed a similar analysis of, investment results. And he also noticed that 3% is the maximum secure version. And that's, when we look at the table, that's exactly what you see here. Because when you look at the 3% withdrawal rate down to 25 years payout period, even with 100% bonds, 100% of people, so all the people did not run out of money. So he acknowledged that 3% is the maximum secure withdrawal rate, but he said that most of his clients would not agree to a withdrawal rate that low. And that's why he went with a 4%. Isn't that crazy? All right, now before I give you some personal notes from me on that paper, first let's talk about the limitations that were discussed in the paper itself. Okay, so they mentioned in the paper that they used the consumer price index, the CPI, to adjust for inflation. Now, sometimes, depending on what you individually spend your money on, this index, the CPI, might be higher than the actual inflation that you are confronted with. For example, if the inflation on cars is incredibly high, but you don't own a car, then that's not relevant for you. Do you know what I mean? All right, and then the other usual stuff. Past returns are not indicative for future returns, which simply means that just because the S&P 500 returned, 10% or 15% on average in the past decade or two, that doesn't mean that it's going to continue like that. Although I have to say, and this is us transitioning into my personal notes, they calculated on a time horizon of 70 years, right? From 1926 to 1995. It included a world war, it included a Great Depression, it included bull markets. So the way I see it, they covered a very good range of all the possible economic scenarios. That was one thing. The other thing is they used corporate bonds, like I said in the beginning, for the Trinity Study. But William Bengen, also called Bill Bengen, he did a similar calculation in 1994, and he calculated with government bonds and still landed on the same conclusion that, 3% is the absolute safe withdrawal rate and 4% is still enough. So the difference between corporate and government bonds in this time didn't seem too large. Also worth mentioning, especially for someone who's not, from the US and living in the US, they only used the S&P 500 for the 100% stocks part. So it did not include international stocks, and it also did not include small caps. Small caps are simply smaller companies that potentially have a higher risk, but also potentially a higher return, because they're small and they have a lot of growth potential. But the S&P 500 is the 500 largest companies of the world. So naturally, small caps are excluded out of this index. Then also worth mentioning, 30 years was the maximum payout period or, time horizon they calculated with. Now, if you want to retire early, like in your 40s or in your 50s, then I would say especially the 4% rule needs reevaluation. Although I remember that Bengen did say at some point, or right at some point, that 3% withdrawal rate would even last you 50 years. Also, the calculations were based on one portfolio, and I assume this is like a private portfolio. So things like social security income and also pension plans are excluded from this. So if you have something like this, this would go on top, right? On top of what you have available in retirement. And then one more word on this capital depletion. So that they counted everything that was above zero, like even $1, as a success. So if you want to have something left over when you die because you want to inherit something to your children or you want to give something to charity, then calculating with capital depletion, so everything ending up at zero, is actually not that good. We would rather have to calculate with capital preservation, right? So we're not using it all up, but we're calculating with that something is left. I'll actually come back to this later in this video. However, when I looked at the details in the Trinity study, it was actually very rare that people ended up at zero. And the worst year apparently was people who retired in 1969. They came the closest of getting to zero, and I think it was because within their payout period, so within their retirement time horizon, there was very high inflation. And all the other ones, they had much more leftovers. Remember the pizza. Whew, that was a lot of information. So now you get a brain teaser. And in that time, you can also consider subscribing if you find that helpful so far. All right, let's talk about the Trinity update and also some critique about the Trinity study. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. When I was researching for this video, I heard in other videos and also read in articles that there is an update from the Trinity study. But I didn't really find that, at least not in the way it sounds, like a new study published in a peer-reviewed journal. What I did found, however, is a blog article from Bill Bengen, who we already talked about. So in a blog article from 2012, and this is what the article is about, that when we talk about retirement and withdrawal rates, we do not just have to worry about the sequence of returns, risk, but also about inflation, so that they both influence the success of our portfolio. Now, what does that mean? Let's decipher it. Now, first, let's talk about the sequence of returns, risk. So when we think of our portfolio, right? And probably the larger part of that portfolio is invested into stocks. Now, we usually talk about an average return of the stock market of 6%, 7%, up to 12% every year. But the thing is that this is averages we talk about, right? And in reality, let me take another color. In reality, the stock market looks like this. So it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, right? And then we usually look at the average. But if we enter retirement and at that time we're at a low in the market, then our portfolio might be not worth this, but it's rather only worth this, okay? And when we then start taking out money out of that portfolio, so we withdraw a certain percentage, right? Then because the market is down and we take money out, then we deplete this faster than we would if the market was we're up here. And this is what it means with sequence of return risk. So it does matter for our portfolio if when we enter retirement, we're at a low or we're at a high. This is the first one. And the second one is inflation. We touched on this briefly when we talked about the Trinity study. So if we take 3% out in the first year, 3. And then in the next year, we are taking out also 3%, but plus inflation. So let's say inflation is 2%. Then the second year, we actually take out 5%, right? So 3 plus 2 inflation equals 5%. Okay. Now, if inflation is high when we enter retirement, like for example 6%, 8%, then the same things happens as if the market was low when we enter retirement, because we have to take out more out of our portfolio in order to cover the cost because inflation is high. And this influences our whole portfolio, right? So we might run the risk of depleting it faster than we would if inflation was low. So if inflation is only 1%, then this would be 4% compared to maybe 9 or 10%. That's why also when you remember the worst cohort in the Trinity Study and also in the simulations that Bill Bengen ran was the cohort of 1969. And just from this cohort, the ones who entered retirement in 1969, he made these two graphs. One shows the portfolio value and the other shows the inflation rate. And you can see that over a pretty long period of time, inflation was very high. So from 1973 to pretty much 1981. So that's 8 years of high inflation. And because of that, the cohort of 1969 would have depleted their wealth already in 1997. And the conclusion of this article was that it is okay to withdraw more out of your portfolio if inflation is high, but he does warn from 2-digit withdrawals. So everything that is 10%, 11%, 12%. Now let's get to the critique of the Trinity Study. Some we already touched upon, like that the outcome of government bonds might be different than of corporate bonds. Others name a historical bias because they used historical data from 1926 to 1995, and they argue that the return of stocks and bonds in that time period has been exceptionally high. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know about that because, as I already mentioned, in my personal view, this was already a very long, time horizon analyzed that included all sorts of different political and economic crises. But nevertheless, some people say that this was too optimistic. They also said that the withdrawal rate was too fixed, like calculating with 3% or 4% or 5% and so on every year, and adjusted for inflation, doesn't give you any dynamic or flexibility to maybe spend less if you need less or spend more if you need more, or to simply adjust it to the market conditions, so spend less in bad years and spend more in good years, which apparently is what retirees sometimes do. And they also mention the payout period, because we only talked about in the Trinity Study about 15 years to 30 years, but now with longevity aspects, and also early retirement, 40 years or 50 years or even 60 years are relevant for some people. And some voices, including mine, also note that this was mainly the US market, right? Not just mainly, it was only the US market with the S&P 500 and also US corporate bonds. So if we look at an international portfolio or in other countries, this might look different. And another point was that, they only looked at stocks and bonds and not other assets as well, like real estate or commodities or other investments. But I actually don't see that as a problem, because if you have rental income from real estate, then you just can't put it on top, right? But anyway, those were the critique points. Now, as a consequence of this critique, people thought about how can we improve the calculations of a safe withdrawal rate, right? So we don't run out of money in retirement. And one of the things that came up were Monte Carlo simulations. Now, what is that? Monte Carlo simulations in general are a statistical technique where they run just 1,000 different models of how a specific situation could turn out. And then at the end, you get some kind of probability. For example, if you test to have a $1 million portfolio and to see if this would be sustainable over the next 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. And then similar like the Trinity Study itself, you can give different scenarios, like different returns of the stock market, different returns of the bond market, and so on. And then it gives you some kind of probability, like, okay, in 75% of cases, your portfolio will last for 30 years or 40 or 50, and in 25% of cases it will not. So it gives you a probability of success. And the pro of this, I guess, is supposed to be that it calculates with all the uncertainties and possibilities and variabilities and not just the historical returns. And the limitation of it that even a machine obviously cannot predict the future. And also here the results, they do depend on assumptions that you make, right? And I personally don't see, first of all, how this would be more accurate than looking at historical data. Because when you think of it, okay, this gets a little philosophical, but I mean, we can only think in terms of what we already know, right? So, I mean, the assumptions that we can make for an analysis like this is very high inflation, maybe a market crash, a depression, but also a bull market. So, you know, a good performing market. So all the things that we already know also from history. And then I personally don't really see how this result is going to be much different. But I can imagine that retirement planners use this kind of analysis. And now for this fourth part, I want to talk about a deep analysis for early retirees. So what I found when I was researching was a series on withdrawal rates, and it's from Early Retirement Now. So this is a blog post from someone from the FIRE movement. FIRE stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. And this guy wrote many articles about all the details we already talked about, also the critique points about the Trinity Study, and how if you want to retire early, this obviously affects how you have to deal with this, right? I will not go too much into detail. Instead, I will link the series down below in the video description. But to make a long story short, he did the calculations himself all over again. And also with this thought in mind that we may calculate with a time horizon or, you know, payout period of 60 years. And he also calculated with all kinds of different scenarios, like different portfolios, you know, more stocks, more bonds, less bonds, government bonds, and so on. And to make a long story short, his conclusion was that the 4% rule works often, but it does come with caveats. Like, for example, if the market is low when you enter retirement, that you may have to cut back on how much you withdraw out of your portfolio, and that's not really fun. And so his conclusion is that a safe withdrawal rate is rather in the range of 3.25% to 4%, depending on the conditions. Now, I think he uses a range on purpose because he doesn't want to give like one number, you know, for everyone, when obviously the conditions are different for people. Like the time horizon may be different depending on when you plan to retire. The risk tolerance may be different, and in this case, not the risk tolerance of, you know, of stocks or the stock market or your investments in general, but rather, am I willing to take the risk that I run out of money and take more money out of my portfolio because I want to? And then the flexibility. I mean, if you're prepared to adjust your withdrawal rate when the market takes a downturn, you might be willing to do that, but other people might not. Now, I personally do not like to calculate with a range because I like it very straightforward and very simple, and a range like 3.25% to 3.5% or 3.25% to 4%, that for me is already too complicated. So what I'm going to do, and I'm also going to live on this channel as of now, is I am going to calculate with 3%. Because when we look back at the Trinity Study, when you remember, the 3% withdrawal rate was the absolute most safest version. Most safe. You know what I mean. And I'm also saying this because when I think about retirement, I rather be prepared for all the worst case scenarios there are. And if they don't happen, I mean, that's great. But when they do happen and I'm already in retirement or at a retirement age, at that time, I will not be able to steer the ship. So if all the worst case scenarios hit, like a high inflation and a bad market, for example, then the only option that I have in that situation would be to cut costs ruthlessly. Would that be possible? Probably yes, because you can always cut costs. But the first question is, at what price? Because after all, retirement is... And the second thing is, how possible is it really? I just remembered a situation where I went to the grocery store and I was standing in line to pay, and in front of me was an old lady. And I could already tell by her appearance that she probably didn't have a lot of money. But then the things that she paid for, you know, it was one package of the cheapest ham there was. and one other item. I don't remember what it was, but she had only those 2 pieces, and she pulled out her wallet and then she picked the coins to pay for it. And in that moment, I was feeling very sad for her. And it also became so clear for me what the goal is. To not have to worry about money in retirement, especially not about those essential things like food. And if you look at the flip side, I think no one would complain to having too much money in retirement, right? Because you can always find ways to spend more money, but there is a limit to how little you can spend to maintain the survival necessities, right? So as of now, I will calculate with 3%. So that would mean if we aim for $1 million in retirement, we could get out $30,000 every year. And I think the younger you plan to retire, the more safe it'll be if you also get along with 2%. And by the way, to use only one number like the 3% also makes it easier for us to actually calculate a target, right? So if you now find 30,000 per year, that's not enough for me, then you already know now, which is a good thing, that you will need more. Maybe 2 million, maybe 3 million. Now, if you're ready to work towards that goal full speed, I'm hosting a free web class where I share all the strategies to build wealth as fast as possible while still not giving up the good life completely. If you want to sign up, there's a link down below. And now I hope you got some more clarity about the 4% rule. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for being here. Bye-bye.